The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the member for Hasluck.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise today to oppose the package of the three bills put forward by the government: the Super Bill 2011, Governance of Australian Government Superannuation Schemes Bill 2011, and the Superannuation Legislation Consequential Amendments and Transitional Provisions Bill 2011. The package gives effect to government decisions in 2008 and 2009 in their attempt to modernise the Australian government superannuation and their desire to establish equitable governance arrangements in line with the broader superannuation industry. And if we take the logic of the argument of the member for Oxley in saying that the board comprises of employer interests, the interests of the military, and employee representation, then the question that runs through my mind is what happens to those employees who are not part of the ACTU union movement and therefore are outside of that agreement. Their voice is not heard. And in a sense, this House has an obligation to all of those people that we represent within our electorates to ensure that the best possible deal prevails for all equally within our thinking, and that the governance arrangements must reflect that. At the core of the change to the legislation is the move by government to amalgamate all civilian, public sector and military superannuation funds into one package. And I listened with interest about the efficiency gains, the net benefit, but I also have questions about the way in which that will truly give some benefits in the long term to those interests that have prevailed within the different superannuation funds. I want to emphasise that the number of superannuation funds that will be centralised, the Gillard government seems keen on centralisation. This bill would see the merger of the Australian Reward and Investment Alliance, the Public Sector Superannuation Scheme, the Public Sector Superannuation Accumulation Plan, the Commonwealth Superannuation Scheme, the Military Superannuation and Benefits Board, and the Defence Force Retirement and Death Benefits Authority, and the Defence Force Superannuation Productivity Benefit Scheme to form a single trustee body called the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation. The legislation will realise the establishment of ComSuper as a statutory agency to provide administrative services or administration services to the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation. The Coalition is inherently opposed to this move, and although I need to acknowledge that some of the amendments made by the government are beneficial, to me it is obvious that the amendments are an attempt to make the legislation more acceptable to the defence community. The bills above were introduced in a slightly different format in June of last year, but lapsed in September 2010. Since then, the Gillard Labor government has worked with haste to insert additional arrangements to ensure the proposed legislation is more likely to pass through both houses. And in terms of the reference to consultation, sometimes the degree of consultation that occurs on some of the complex pieces of legislation that passes through this House and with some of the stakeholders is not as thorough as it should be, nor is it as comprehensive. And sometimes it is easier to consult with very limited fields of stakeholder interest. The major concern to the Coalition is the amalgamation of defence superannuation into the civilian superannuation sector and the level of influence the Australian Council of Trade Unions will have on the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation Board. The bill merges trustees into a single entity under the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation. The Corporation's board will consist of 11 members, as my colleague on this side of the House outlined previously, appointed by the Minister of Finance and Deregulation. This is where the major problem arises, and the Labor government is using this bill as a Trojan horse to raise the levels of undue influence of the ACTU over the pensions of hundreds and thousands of Australian workers. I would also bet London to a brick that a substantial number of members of the various funds that are being amalgamated are not members of unions, and therefore their interests would not be canvassed under the ACTU membership coverage. If this bill is passed, the board members will be appointed by the Minister for Finance, Senator the Honourable Penny Wong. The proposed board would comprise an independent chair plus 5 employer directors chosen in consultation between the Finance and Defence Ministers, and bizarrely 3 members would be nominated by the President of the ACTU, leaving just 2 members of the board to be nominated by the Chief of the Defence Force. This is unacceptable to the members of our armed forces and thousands of veterans and retired defence personnel across Australia. The military is a unique employer of Australian citizens. Military personnel risk their lives daily in operations around the world to protect our freedoms and the national interest, and I honestly believe they deserve better. As such, I oppose the concept of a forced merger of civilian and military superannuation schemes. This effort once again highlights the low regard in which the Gillard Labor government holds our armed forces in. Now, to make this more palatable to the defence and veteran community, once the bill lapsed, the government went back to the drawing board and came up with the creation of the Defence Force Assessment Panel. The Defence Force Assessment Panel would review any decision referred to it by the overarching Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation relating to military matters such as death and disability pensions. This placated some in the defence sector and reassured them that their matters, and unique matters at that, would be handled with some deference and special attention. However, the legislation would not hold the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation liable to the recommendations of the Defence Force Assessment Panel. So this move is just a way for the government to pay lip service to the concerns of our Australian Defence Force while pressing ahead with its agenda. And having worked in a number of areas, both within the education, Aboriginal affairs and health arenas, often when you have subsidiary structures established, what happens is the corporate body or the overarching group takes that advice which it deems necessary in its decision-making processes and will then only include in their deliberations those elements that they want. I would certainly want to see a far better and stronger guarantee that the advice that came from the Australian Defence Force would be taken much more strongly in deliberation and certainly incorporated into the thinking of the board's decision-making processes. I'm sure that thousands of the Australian people, and many of those in my electorate of Hasluck, would like to know how, on a board of 11 people with several defence pension schemes integrated, that the ACTU could be represented by 3 people and the ADF by just 2. This is a travesty and highlights the Coalition's position not to merge the 2 sectors together. How can this government really be trusted to look after the interests of our military personnel when they allow the ACTU to have such a significant influence over the board? There should be no special provisions for the ACTU on this board. All board members should be appointed by the Minister for Finance, while the defence sector retains its representation of 2 as a result of the unique nature of military service and the defence community's special circumstances. As it stands, the ACTU can nominate more directors than the Chief of the Australian Defence Force. This is the world that Labor is trying to create for all Australians, and is a concept that should be of concern to any decent public sector worker or military personnel in this country. It raises the question once again of who is really in charge of the government: the unions, the Greens, the Labor right or the Labor left. The legislation currently provides that the Minister for Finance cannot remove an ACTU-nominated director unless the President of the Australian Council of Trade Unions agrees. This will include circumstances of mental incapacitation, physical illness, non-attendance or misbehaviour which would leave the Minister for Finance powerless to dismiss this person. This is completely unacceptable and gives the President of the ACTU more power than the Finance Minister of Australia, one of the nation's most important portfolios. Somehow this is quite acceptable to the Labor government, which relies heavily on the unions for their support. Unchecked, this legislation would allow the ACTU to have a say on how the Defence Force superannuation would be managed, while the peer-staffed Defence Force Case Assessment Panel can be relegated to a noise that can be ignored. Alongside these problems, the power given to the ACTU by way of a numerical representation would allow it to block meetings from even taking place. A quorum of 9 members is required for a board meeting. So if there was a topic that the ACTU did not want to discuss or delay until a more suitable time, they could decide not to attend and the meeting would have to be postponed. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government's decision makes sense given its track record of blame shifting on important issues. If the Australian Defence Force superannuation interests are ignored or neglected, then the Prime Minister can throw her hands up and blame the legislation for not allowing the dismissal of a board member or board members, or for the control of the ACTU, which has been accorded. These are important issues that impact on hundreds of thousands of Australians, and it is thanks to the coalition that the taxpayer, the armed forces and the superannuation sector know about these issues. Madam Deputy Speaker, I stand today to oppose this legislation, particularly the marginalisation of the Defence Force representation on the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation Board. I equally oppose the level of influence afforded to the Labor power broker, the ACTU, the lack of dismissal powers accorded to the Minister for Finance in respect to the ACTU nominees. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.